1506. The origin of all the misfortune of Portugal and Europe were traced to these blasphemers of the Holy Mother of God. This was enough. The mob goaded into a roaring frenzy, headed by John Moco and Frater Bernardo, both monks of the Order of St. Dominic, who fiercely incited the rabble of at least 10,000 degraded and cruel ruffians to the most disgraceful deeds. Laurent, a secretary of the Court of Blood, says of this massacre in her book, Critical History of the Inquisition, that they slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires. The Negroes and the vilest rabble had kindled at the church doors, to which they kept constantly adding fuel. On Monday, the numbers of the mob were considerably increased from the surrounding villages. The massacre and butchery of the new Christians was continued. Their houses were broken, whole families being murdered. The merciless wretches dashed out the brains of the infants against the wall. Pregnant women were thrown from windows on pikes of those below. Women were outraged, and virgins were violated. Such were the horrors committed in the capital of Portugal in that day. 12 centuries of Jewish persecution, a brief outline of the sufferings of the Hebrew race in Christian lands, by Gustav Perelson, 1898. So in the massacre of 1506 in Portugal, according to the author, they slew and mangled their victims while casting many still alive into the fire. Negroes. The writer even calls this quote the massacre and butchery of the new Christians. Remember, it was the black Portuguese Jews who were converted to be new Christians. So what was the name of this particular massacre? Vitimus do Massacre Judaico in 1506 in Rossio Square, right outside the Church of St. Dominic, as the writer confirms. The mob goaded into a roaring frenzy, headed by John Moco and Frater Bernardo, both monks of the Order of St. Dominic, who fiercely incited the rabble of at least 10,000 degraded and cruel ruffians to the most disgraceful deeds. There are walking tours of this place in Libsyn to this day. The estimate is that nearly 4,000 people were executed that day. This is the same location where slaves gathered for different forms of spiritual assistance and brotherhood during the start of the slave trade in the 15th century. Then there are unknown, unnamed massacres and mass graves. For instance, in the March of 2019, an interesting discovery was found in Lagos, Portugal, in a rubbish dump. A mass grave of more than 150 Africans found with their hands bound and tied behind their backs. These mass graves were created between the 15th to the 17th century, the same time period of the Inquisitions and the Auto da Fe's, aka persecution of the Negro Jews of Portugal. Even more interesting is the state that these bodies were found in, hands tied behind their back. So let's see if we can connect the dots in the 15th to the 17th century. It is well-established history that in France alone, thousands of Jews were burned at the stake. On one occasion, 160 men and women and children were bound hand and foot and thrown into a ditch. Wood was piled on them and the torch applied, while numbers of the priests stood by with uplifted hands, calling on their Savior to witness the suffering of the unbelieving Jews. Whole families were burned in this funeral for the reason that these pious Christians could not see them separated. Commentaries on Christian and Hebrew mythologies by Ladd Parrish. Then there's the unnamed massacres of Macombo, which were so many that the Negroes that were killed there were left for dead in the streets, to the point that King Emmanuel said, "They are not buried as well as they should be. They are thrown on the ground in such a manner that they are discovered and eaten by dogs." So a neighborhood that was once known as a refuge for Negroes fleeing persecution became a house of horrors. Manuel in 1515, less than 10 years after Vidimus do massacre Judaico in Razio Square, which is only 1.5 miles from Macombo, ordered a massive grave site known as Pocos dos Negros, the Blacks' Pit, to be built there. And where was it built? On the corner of Jude Street, Travessa do Judeu. One more interesting phenomenon that was birthed during this period of mass executions and unmarked graves, Black Yahudim, are the Gothic bone churches that began to spring up. Yes, I said bone churches. Churches that was built with the bones and skeletons of the dead built into the walls of the cathedrals. One such instance is Capela dos Ossos, the Chapel of Bones, in Évora, Portugal, built between 1460 and 1510, during the time of Vidimus do massacre Judaico, which occurred in 1506. The chapel sits in the Church of St. Francis and was built from bones from Franciscan monks. According to the story, the monks built the chapel out of bones to solve the problem of cemeteries taking up space in Évora. Remember, having a lack of space to bury dead bodies was the same problem that occurred in Macombo because of the Auto da Fés, to the point that King Emmanuel had to commission Pocos dos Negros, the Negroes' Pit. See, there's another curious element to the Auto da Fés that might shed some light on why a person might hang something from a condemned dead person's body in a church as a memento. This habit of the penitent and sackcloth of condemned heretics is to be hung up in the church of that parish where they dwell, that these sort of ensigns may be a monument to keep the everlasting remembrance of their impiety. For the name of the heretics and the reasons of their condemnation are to be inscribed and renewed on them. The History of the Inquisition by Lembrock Philippus, 1633-1712. So during the Auto da Fés, or Acts of Faith, the clothes of the convicted dead were hung up in the churches on display as a memorial of their execution and condemnation. One example of the hanging of dead victims' clothing and the curation of the bones of the Negroes during the Auto da Fés takes us all the way to Rwanda, where in 1994, the genocide of more than 800,000 Hutus and Tutsis took place. One of the lesser known facts about the genocide is the role that the Catholic Church played. In an article by The Guardian labeled Rwanda Genocide, Catholic Church sorry for the roles of priests and nuns in killings, the author wrote, "The Catholic Church in Rwanda apologized on Sunday for the church's role in the 1994 genocide, saying it regretted the actions of those who participated in the massacres. We apologize for all the wrongs the church committed. We apologize on behalf of all Christians for all forms of wrongs were committed." The statement acknowledged that the church members planned, aided, and carried out the genocide, in which more than 800,000 ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed by Hutu extremists. In Rwanda, in the territory of Ntarama, a church has been immortalized because of the brutal slaughter that took place there during the Rwandan tragedy. This Catholic Church, just like the auto-da-fés of the past, has the victims, the Negroes, clothing hanging from the rafters as a memorial, and also an ossuary of the bones of the said victims.